So last time we talked a little bit about pattern adjustments, and we're going to re-approach that today. We're going to talk about it some more. We're going to talk about it as we're cutting out. So if there's anything from last time where you're like, not quite sure why and how we did that, we'll talk about it again as we're cutting out and laying out our pattern pieces. So don't worry. So, and mostly we've just talked about the project and pattern adjustment. So there hasn't been too much technical detail yet, but we are getting into what I think is not my favorite part. Cutting out fabric is never my favorite part. It's fairly tedious. It's a necessary evil, but I really love when I start thinking about the design portion. And part of cutting out the fabric today for me is the design portion. We did talk a lot about design in the last two sessions. It's really critical to be thinking about your design as you go along. So one of the things I do for myself these days is I draw the design from my brain onto a piece of paper. And part of the choice to do that is for the Grand Arbiter, because he's not a super visual person like I am, like a lot of sewists are. So I know many of us who sew can really see our design in our head, or we can see ideas in our head, or we've got, a mood board on Pinterest, or we've seen a still in a movie that's inspiring us. So we've got these visual cues for our project, but Glenn is not a sewist, so he doesn't think about costume in that way. He needs me to show him. He can't imagine it. So I started sketching in part to be able to communicate with Glenn. And then there's a very long, involved story that is probably not for today, but I also started sketching as a sort of healing from youthful trauma. And so it's very important to me to draw and to challenge myself to draw, because this is not a critique of anyone else. I consider myself a very bad visual artist. Like, I'm not good at drawing. And so forcing myself to draw and hone my skills and practice them has been very good for me. So that's sort of like an additional bonus. But this is the bustle dress I am making for myself. And it's got a lot going on with it. I talked a bit about it on Patreon, but it has all of these like faux scales going down the front. And then it has this overskirt, which you can see a little better from the back, the overskirt. And so the overskirt wraps around and covers almost the entirety of the foundation skirt, with like a little bit of the foundation skirt peeking out, probably in back. So here's the thing. I don't have to have silk on all of the foundation skirt, because so much of it is hidden by decoration, by the overskirt. But if I'm going to have it be a plain cotton underneath that overskirt, I need to make sure when my overskirt shifts as I'm moving or sitting or what have you, that I don't reveal my terrible secret and my ankles at the same time. So when you are cheating out your fabric, you have to keep in mind that you want to go a little above the edge of where you think the overskirt is going to line up over the foundation skirt. So I like to sort of sketch it out on my pattern pieces as I'm cutting them, to give myself a sense of where I'm going to piece in the silk, or the weird pattern pieces I'm going to make out of my silk to cause it to fit in these places, because the side pieces always get this kind of weird L shape. So part of the bottom is covered and part of the leading edge is covered, in other words. And so we're going to look at how that goes and how I do that. I think I mentioned last time that this is a very historical approach to creating garments, that they have been doing this for centuries. This is just a very clever way in which dressmakers have saved money and still maintain a beautiful finished garment. It also has the added advantage of like it lightens the weight of your garment, which is like when you've got a lot of trim, sometimes having a little bit less weight makes the garment a little cooler and more comfortable. So it can be an economizing choice as well as just like for wear, making your garment a little bit lighter. I am going to be using cotton muslin as my sort of foundation fabric for my skirt. And typically, when I am doing one of these bustle skirts, I typically flatline the whole thing in cotton muslin anyway. So what that means for all of you today is that when you are thinking about your foundation skirt, you should be thinking about like, am I going to line this? And why would I line this? So do I need to cut out lining fabric as well as my fashion fabric? And I actually think lining is the preferred way to go. I generally, even when I'm like, oh, I want that garment to be lighter, I generally line it because it gives it a stable foundation on which to put trim, to hang off my knife pleats or my ruffles or what have you, and it gives it a nicer drape. But I've absolutely done some skirts where I'm like, you know what? This is like for wearing in the summer, and it's not going to have a lot of trim on it. It's just not going to be lined. And I love to do that with my linen skirts when I'm making summer clothes for living here. And like, I don't do this anymore, but we used to go down and do Eldorado Days in Tombstone in October every year as a steampunk group. And y'all, it is still blazingly hot in October in Tombstone. And wearing a full silk frock may be a flex, but it is also a great way to have heat stroke. So, like, I tend to wear cotton or linen when I'm doing that kind of event. And I love a linen skirt over a cotton one for lightness and breathability and wicking qualities. Linen is a pretty fabulous fabric. And when I know I'm making it for hot weather, I just don't flatline it. But 90% of the time I'm flatlining. And if you are not familiar with that term, we're going to talk about it. Don't worry. But also ask away if I say anything that is like confounding. So this is my beautiful gold silk skirt that I made for the Scarab Sunrise. And this is what it looks like on the inside. You see, each panel has a cotton muslin backing. It's flat lined to the cotton muslin. And what that means is that for every skirt piece I cut out of my fashion fabric, I've also cut a piece out of my lining fabric. And then I sew them together so they are flat together, one piece, and then I sew the garment as usual. So that's flat lining when you attach your lining to your piece so they're one unit. Normally I serge them together. So you can see this serged edge here on my seams. That's where I serged the flat lining to my fashion fabric. And typically I rely heavily on the 505 spray for this. Is one of my favorite little cheaty tools. I know I talked about it in the corset class. I think I've talked about it on a lot of our classes. For like a fairly reasonable price from WowWack. It's cheaper at WowWack still, significantly cheaper than at Joann's. This saves me so much anguish, frustration, stress, and it makes things like flatlining a lot easier. So I rely heavily on this for doing these kinds of projects. You can do it with pins. You can do it with hand basting. I have some acquaintances who swear by hand basting their entire flat lining to their fashion fabric. Y'all, these panels are like 40 inches long. I just, No, thank you. So that's a lot of hand basting. But if you want to do that, just remember I'm lazy and you're less lazy than I am, and I admire you. So there's no shame in hand basting. It's just that it takes quite a bit more time to do. So that is sort of like things to think about as you're going in to cut your fabric. Um,
I
I
have a
think
flatlining question.
yes.
So, so I've flatlined a few things, and do you leave the bottom unflatlined so that when you hang it, and the fabric stretches, you don't get that weird, uh, like I get a weird thing, like a little
a, a
extra
little
bit.
pocket, a little
Yes.
pocket, right? Yeah. So this is a great question. And thank you for asking, Martha. So when you are dealing with these big panels, like we're discussing for the skirt, it's a good idea to remember you're probably going to hang the skirt for a little while, 24 hours or longer before you hem it. And Martha's right. Sometimes your fashion fabric will stretch at a rate that is different from your flat lining. It will probably stretch more, but it varies. Regardless, you can get like a little pocket at the bottom of the panel where they have stretched differently. And now there's like this bubble of air that you don't want. So, yes, I leave the hem portion unstitched when I am flatlining my panels. I usually do the long side seams and the top edge. But sometimes I leave the top edge open too, because really it's going into the waistband and no one's going to see it. But if I'm on like a surging roll, I'll just do all three sides and leave that long bottom edge open, because when I hang it, I'm going to hang it with that bottom edge towards the ground, and gravity is going to have the biggest impact as it sort of stretches the fabric. If the fabric stretches, sometimes it doesn't stretch on you. There's not a lot of bias in these panels. There's just like a tiny amount of bias. So, and for those unfamiliar with the term bias, that means on the angle, a sort of usually 45 degrees across the grain of the fabric, and it will give you stretch, which is beautiful, very useful, does some really cool things. But the more of that angle you have, the more stretch you get. And so on some of these panels, there are areas in which you have just like a tiny angle and some where you have a lot of an angle. And so you can get a tiny amount of stretch on that bottom edge. A lot of it's cut fairly straight on the grain, so there's not a lot of stretch, but there are a couple of places, especially that back, center back panel with the dramatic curve at the bottom edge is the one where it's most likely to have a bit of stretch going on. So it's a good idea to plan to hang it for 24 hours before we hem it. But we'll return to that when we get to hemming. So Cake has camped out on my fabric, which is very helpful. Hello, Cake. Um, so my center front panel has no silk on it as a base layer. It is just going to be muslin straight down from the waist to the hem, because I'm covering it in all of those beautiful scales like a fool. And I'm sure I'll love it when I'm done with it. And in the midst of creating it, I'm going to probably say many colorful things and curse my own designs. But I don't have to worry. I'm not flatlining it. I'm just using the muslin to be my base for those scales. It's possible I'll go in and be like, ooh, I should have done 2 layers of muslin here because that's a lot of weight. So I'm going to churn over that a little bit before we meet again and before I start applying the scales. It's a lot to do that kind of treatment, and so I might need to make my center front panel beefier to hold up to all of the weight of the trim. But my side panel and the center back panel, I think, are the most interesting. And so I want to show you how I would cut those today, as well as how I'm going to trace out where the silk is ultimately going to go on my panel. So my silk has not arrived yet, so I'm just going to be like tracing it out and cutting the silk when it gets here, hopefully Monday. They're pretty quick, but they had some big sales, so they have a backlog right now. And I'm just patient with them. All right. Cake, you're a menace. A tiny, beautiful menace. Oh my gosh. So my muslin is 45-inch wide, which is kind of a pretty standard measurement. A lot of cottons come in 45-inch wide. You can get muslin in everything from 36-inch wide to like, what is it, 120 inches wide. That's because it's used in quilting and used in quilt backs. I don't recommend the 120-inch wide muslin for dressmaking unless that's what you just have on hand, because it's a lot to deal with. My silk is 54-inch wide, which is usually notated as 60-inch wide in the dressmaking world. So if you ever get 54-inch wide fabric and you're like, oh my gosh, how do I get 60 inches? The pattern is expecting you to have 54-inch wide fabric. So all of these yardages, these widths are like slightly under the measurement. That's industry standard. That's the expectation. It has to do with the width of the loom. I'm not sure why they round up, but they do. So here we are. I'm sure it has something to do with weird, awful men in the 19th century. That's normally the answer. Sometimes it's weird, awful men in the 20th century who are like, they'll never notice women, how they can't do math. We can just like round up. I have no idea. I'm just imagining. So, oh my God, Cake, stop being so cute. This is terrible. You're too cute. How am I supposed to work? Come here. Yes. Okay, my darling. You have to get down. So I have gone in and pressed my muslin. During class last time, I commented that um, for a demo of how to do pattern adjustments and how to like mark things, it was not a big deal. But in terms of cutting my fabric and really committing to the sizes and the shape, it's a good idea to press your fabric. I will also add that not only does the pressing make your fabric smoother and easier to deal with, but it also will, that high heat and steam sort of helps clean your fabric a little bit. So one of the reasons you like to, let me reword that. One of the reasons you are encouraged to wash fabric before working with it is because it's been on a shelf in a warehouse for an amount of time that is unknown, which means that it could bring things home with it to your house. Dust is like the most minor thing on that list that it could have on it, because all sorts of critters and creatures live in warehouses. And so giving it a good hot press helps to kill any little bugs or anything else. It also gives you an opportunity to review your fabric and make sure that there are no weird stains or marks on the yardage as you're going across it. The other reason with a project like this, unless you are planning your project in such a way that you can wash the finished garment, usually there's nothing washable about a bustle dress once you get done with it. There's like too much fussy trim happening. And so the only kind of pre-shrinking it's getting is from a really hot, steamy iron. So that works great when you're dealing with natural fibers, silk, wool, cotton, linen. But when you get into the synthetic fibers, it's a little bit different. You're not exactly able to put your iron on the hottest setting and murder everything that could be attached to your fabric with your iron. I recommend using a pressing cloth if you're using your synthetics, and still giving it a fairly steamy press, as hot as you can without melting your fabric. So test with that pressing cloth. It will give you a little bit more grace from scorching or melting your fabric, but you can still do those things with a synthetic. So proceed with caution. All right. So we're going to start out with our side panel. I'm just getting my fabric laid out here. I'm going to rely a lot on pattern weights because I love them. But everywhere I use pattern weights, you can use straight pins. I will talk a little bit about pinning and like approaches to pinning, because as you are getting into it, if you are a newer sewist, you may have a tendency to use more pins than you really need, or to pin in ways that are inefficient. I like to encourage people to move to pattern weights for everything that you can, but sometimes you just have a project where you have to pin. The fabric moves too much. It's too slinky. It's too, wiggly. Pattern weights will not give you a good, clean shape when you are cutting. So in those cases, it's nice to know how to pin. Okay. All right. When I am cutting something large like this, I also find it easier to cut if I'm standing. These days, I do a lot of cutting sitting, which saves me spoons and energy and is great. But this is big and I need to have the full range of motion. I also see that there are a couple of Oh, yes. So Andy, Captain Azar says she uses washers that are glued together as pattern weights, cheap and easy. That's a great option. You can get, scads of washers at Ace is the place, my favorite. Martha uses heavy nuts and covers them with Fimo. Oh my gosh, that's excellent as well. Yeah. And so there are a lot of options. I'm kind of, I guess I'm lazy. I mostly bought mine, but Deborah, who hasn't been to any of our workshops in a while, but Deborah Hensley Tay, who has participated in the past, she loves to make little stash busters out of cute things. And she made me these really cute square pattern weights, and they have BBs inside that give them their weight, and they're great. I actually love these square ones. So, all right, let's take a look. We've got a beautiful sweep of gorgeously pressed muslin with nothing going on it, which is, both terrifying and exciting. The world's your oyster. Also, Cake is helping. Hi, Cake. Here we go. Yeah, right in the middle of the fabric, Cake. Excellent. Good positioning. I've got my handy dandy ruler out and about. So as I mentioned last time, I've abused this pattern a lot. So at this point, I will abuse it more. But if you've got a fresh pattern, I love preserving the pattern by not cutting into it and making up a new master instead. But since I've already cut this and taped this and abused it, it's up for more cutting, taping, and abusing until I replace it. I like to sort of start in the center with my pattern weights and move them out. You can see I kind of like spread along any of the air pockets in my pattern so it's nice and smooth and firm to my fabric. Not strictly necessary to do that, but it is a thing I do without thinking about it now, so I thought I'd call it out. Okay, use a lot of pattern weights. Don't stint. If you've got them, use them. At this point, I could directly just cut with my rotary cutter. I don't have to trace it out. But if you want to be very, very precise when you're cutting, you can always trace around your pattern and then cut that way. I don't find that this pattern is so persnickety. I'm that worried about the accuracy. There are some things like the fitted bodice where I find it's a good idea to trace because your measurements are sort of like on a corset where like a 16th of an inch can really throw off your fit. But this is a very forgiving pattern. So I usually just cut as I go. I love a rotary cutter for this. The nice 45mm rotary blade is nice for these long cuts. There are no curves, so easy peasy. One of the things that's important when using a rotary cutter is to like hold it as though it's an extension of your arm and you want it to move away from your body as you're cutting or move from your dominant side to your non-dominant side across your body. The other trick with a rotary cutter is you want to start a little bit before where you're cutting, go a little bit after where you're cutting, so you make sure the pressure on the wheel finishes the complete cut. Oh my gosh. Let me get my regular scissors for a moment here. So if you are somebody who prefers dressmaking shears for this, there's also an important approach to using shears. And so you'll notice that dressmaking shears have a nice flat side on them. And then they have, most of them have this kind of like little dog leg angle. This blade is very straight. It wants to do some work for you. It wants to cut straight lines, but you have to use it properly to cut down on your work. So you want to slide the tip of your blade under your fabric and cut with the whole of the length of the blade as you're going. So you're just gonna cut, cut, cut. And you'll notice I don't lift my fabric as I'm cutting. It's very important because when you lift like this, you start to change the shape of the fabric. You are going to alter the drape and your fit is going to be off. So these need to be sharpened. But I just go in and I'm going to use the whole length of the shear to cut along, and I'm not going to lift the fabric as I go. I'm going to let the fabrics rest on the table. But those need to be sharpened, so we're going to finish our cuts with the very sharp rotary blade instead. The rotary blade does make this go faster. It eases the wear and tear on my hands. And if I haven't gotten my shears sharpened in a while, it's really easy to get a nice sharp rotary blade. When you're working with the rotary blade, just make sure that you are pressing down sufficiently to get all of your cuts. These Kai ones are really cool because they have the ability to adjust the depth of the cut for you depending on the thickness of your fabric, which is very handy. Okay. So now that we have our cut fabric, I have these little marks here on my pattern that are going to help me line things up. And what I'm doing right now is I'm just putting a pin where those marks go. Sometimes I cut them, sometimes I draw them in. I'm going to show you both. It's also worth noting that on this particular pattern, the leading edge of your side, this is our side panel, the leading edge that attached to the front is a straight line, and the back edge is at an angle that attaches to the center back pattern piece. And part of why we've got this angle going on is because we're forcing the shape of the bustle, which is going to be protruding from your body in the back. So these are called notches, and sometimes I forget that term because brain fog is amazing. So is menopause. I'm not going to be marking in my darts right now because I will adjust those for me personally once I've flatlined the whole thing together. But that said, let me go back. If you want to mark your darts or the dart legs, you can do something similar with the pins. This is called pin marking. Just line your pin up with the top of the dart leg on either side of the leg you think you need. I know that I will probably need 2 darts in my panel because I cut it for my hips and my waist measurement is much smaller than my hip measurement. So I normally need to put in an additional dart. But that is some stuff we will talk about as we're going. So I've got these little pins in here, and I can just go in and mark my notches by drawing a little triangle that is wider on either side of the pin and then meets at a point where the pin goes through the fabric. Like so. The cat is really making that hard to see. Hello, cat. Hi, Cake. Your timing is impeccable. Okay, there we go. So I can just draw it in like so, or what I typically do is I go in with my little shears and I cut little notches. Some people will cut a full-on little triangle at that notch point and cut in to their fabric. if I'm going to cut notches, I normally have them sticking out rather than cutting into my fabric. But what I often do is just cut two little lines, one for each notch. And I cut them at about 3/8 to 1/4 of an inch so that it gives me a tiny shape, but it's really just a kind of two tiny little cuts. And so I can line up those cuts, but I haven't imperiled the main body of my fabric that much. I'll be lost in the seam allowance. In terms of my little dog legs for my darts, I'm just going to put a little mark next to where those pins are as a reminder. That's where I think the dart might go, like so. But I'm not going to commit yet to that dart because I know that I'm going to be adjusting it. So this is like the basic cut of the flat lining panel. And if you're doing your fashion fabric, you're going to cut it the same way, where you are going to make those marks. You're going to make sure everything's nice and smooth. But the thing that I'm going to be doing that's different is I now need to trace out my weird little L shape that's going on in this fabric, so I know where to apply my silk. So I love these gridded rulers that you can see through. They're very, very handy. They're part of the wild world of quilting. And so it's very nice. This is my 6-inch wide ruler, super handy for things like this. And this is a 3.5-inch wide ruler. So I know I want to have at least 3.5 inches, but I actually think I want it to be more like 5 inches over so that there's plenty of play here in the front. I might even go with 6. Because I know the front edge is the one where the overskirt is most likely to fall back and reveal anything underneath. And so I want to make sure I've got plenty of camouflaged fabric. What will happen is I will essentially just applique the fashion fabric on top of this. So I'm going to be tracing this in with Sharpie. Normally, I would not recommend you trace things in with Sharpie because it can show through. But I want you guys to be able to see what I'm doing, and the black ink is just not very visible. So I'm just going in right along that 6-inch line, and I'm drawing a line all the way down my panel. I recommend typically using a pencil or a Frixion pen or what have you to really preserve the integrity of the fabric and make sure that when you go in and you're cleaning things up, you can just erase it. I'll put this mark on the inside of my panel so it won't be super visible. Now, on the bottom edge here, I want a little bit more than 6 inches. I think that it's going to be more exposed.
Bottom.
Okay. Thank you, my darling. So I think it's going to be, yeah, good. I think the bottom edge, the overskirt is going to reveal more of this bottom edge, partly by design, but also just vis-a-vis movement. So I'm going to give myself 12 inches down here at the bottom. Just going to give myself a couple of little hash marks. And once again, line that up. So all of this is going to have silk applied to it so that you will not see the cotton underneath. But I have this nice big chunk of fabric here where I don't need to apply the silk. It also means I can use some weird off-cut pieces to fill in some of these segments if I need to. The nice thing about I don't know if you can see that. I can see the marks from my Sharpie all the way through both layers of the fabric. So that can be handy in terms of like mimicking both sides. But typically what I do is I draw in my marks on both pattern pieces as I'm going, so I remember what I'm doing. Otherwise, I have to go back in and check my measurements and review and remind myself.
So you'll do the applique in two pieces with the silk on top or in one piece?
If I can, I'll cut it in one piece so that I don't have a weird little seam there. But if I can't, I can do it in two pieces. So yeah, that's a good question. Normally, I don't want to have a visible seam there with the applique because it gives more of a semblance that it's just one subtle thing. But if I do embed a seam line there, if I cut it in two, I might cut the bottom as one whole piece and then the top as a second piece because I'm going to be doing that trim. And I know I'm going to have that trim. So having a seam there, I'll be able to potentially disguise more. It also depends how far I'm taking those. Depends on how far I take the scales around. If I'm taking them all the way in to the side of the fabric up to this like 6-inch mark, then I can hide a seam under the scales. So part of piecing is always thinking about what trim you're going to do and where you can hide any seams. I haven't started making the scales yet, so I don't know. I don't have the silk yet. I don't have the silk yet. And also I'm going to be going in waves with the scales because I know that they will be very tedious and take a fair amount of time. Oh gosh, pardon me. And so in order to save my sanity, I'm going to do them in like batches as I get the silk. Also, I'm ordering my silk in batches so that I don't beggar myself each month. So it's my monthly treat of silk fabric, 3 yards at a time or whatever. Yeah, anyway, but it's a long project, so I know that I can like sort of cheat out my purchases this way and like build as I go. I think it's nice when you can get everything in one fell swoop because there's a lot of dopamine with that, but it's always possible to just like do things in waves of purchases. So yeah, I hope that answers the question though. Normally I try and do it as one solid piece of fabric without a seam. But if I'm like piecing fabric to save myself again on yardage and what I have, like if I'm using offcuts from the overskirt or the bodice, then I can always think of ways to hide any seams with trim. So.
Yeah. And your lines there are totally making me think of the paper piece, the quilting paper piecing that I did for the Sauron is.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like a very similar kind of concept, I think. Although I haven't done paper piecing, I've just read about it and admired yours, Cindy.
Oh, so much easier than I ever thought it was going to be, but
oh my gosh. Well, sometime I will pick your brain about it because I was really impressed with the way it came together. So when it comes to this back panel, the back panel is just kind of the most irksome because it's so wide to cut, and we've got that curve at the bottom, right? As Cindy is miming on camera, and there's just a lot. So the panel is drafted at 22 inches wide, which makes it completed with the 44 inches as drafted. And as we discussed last time, if you have to, you can piece this back panel. Again, it's important to think about how you're going to hide your seams. I don't recommend putting a center back seam if you can help it, because it's under the most strain in the garment. So putting 2 side seams instead to piece out your panel is very reasonable. I like a big bustle. I like a very big bustle, and I'm a very large lady, so I feel like I can pull off a maximal bustle, and that it's more along the lines of the proportions I want anyway, because I'm already taking up a lot of space. Why not take up more space? Also, as a feminist statement, which is not something we talk about with bustle dresses, usually people are not like, ooh, what a feminist garment. They're normally like, that doesn't seem very feminist. But taking up space is a great reason to make costumes and be present in a space. Like, so I like to make a big prominence on my tush. But that means typically I cut my panels the full 54 inches of my silk when I do them, rather than stopping at that 44 inches. So that's another 10 inches of width. And normally, no big deal. But because the silk is that wide, but the muslin I'm using is 45-inch wide muslin. So you can see there's a little challenge here if I cut it going the length of the fabric. So when I have something like that, as long as I have shortened it for me and I don't need it to be super long because I'm not doing a train or anything, then I just do my cut on the width of my back panel. So, or on my fabric. So I'll show you what that means here, because I feel like that I said that all very intentionally, and even I'm like, well, what does that mean, Jocelyn? So let's look at that. We're also going to look at the curve adjustment again for the bottom of the panel, because I know there was a question about that. So, and Cindy, I think you answered that question really well in the chat. Speaking of, Martha, you asked a really good question. I'm going to come back to our schedule and the classes we're going to miss. Today, I'm just going to show you how I lay out that back panel and talk some more about that extension. I'm probably not going to cut the whole thing today because, or on camera, because it's a lot of me just silently cutting a really big piece of fabric. But I want to show you how I lay it out so you guys can prepare for yourselves.
I have a muslin question while we're talking about
Yes,
your muslin, if this is an
yes,
okay time.
yes, it is.
Did you say what weight of muslin you typically use for your
Oh,
flat lining?
so I normally just go to the quilting section and I try and pick something that's not too flimsy. So I don't have a weight on that. That's a great question. I know fabric comes in different weights, but I try to get one that's like a little bit on the opaque side. I usually get unbleached muslin. Has a nice tooth to it, so that it's going to be up to what we're about to do to it, all the terrible, wonderful things we're going to do to this fabric. So I try not to get anything too flimsy. These days, I mostly buy my muslin through Mood, by the 5-yard bundle whenever I'm buying other fabric, because it's such a great deal. And I really like the weight of that particular muslin. this is what I'm using today, and it's pretty nice. It's crisper than what I can get at Joann's, for instance. And I like that for my foundation. So good question. I don't have the weight or the thread count. And I just sort of go by vibes, which is not the most satisfying answer, but it's a very honest answer. However, that mood muslin, great quality, very inexpensive when you're buying other things. It's like $3 a yard, I think. So not a bad price. It used to be like $2 a yard. They went up recently.
I
So
do feel like Mood should give you a deal on something. Everything is so expensive there.
Yeah, right? Yes, it is. I typically go to Mood for very specific projects, right? Because I can't find them elsewhere. Thank you. Andy has the direct link. When you go to check out, they will offer you this deal where they're like, would you like 5 yards of muslin for this great deal? And I always say, yes, I would. And so Andy's got all the deets. It's a medium weight muslin. It's great. It's really nice for doing this sort of thing with. And the price is excellent. But I don't buy everything at Mood. There are a few, because it is not the cheapest place to go. Isn't that? You can find some things that are a great deal. I like to watch for their sales. But for instance, I needed a bunch of beautiful cotton voile. I did not want to dye myself, and I found a good price at Mood, and they had the color I wanted. So I bought cotton voile, and I also bought muslin because that's how I do. So yeah, it's good to get any kind of deal. They do send you like a 10% discount card every time you order, but it has a very short window of usage. Like you have to order again in a month to use it. And that 10% really just covers shipping, which is like that's not the worst thing. It's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick, but it's like also 10% can be a very small amount over the overall budget. So yes, yeah. Anyway, great question.
Good. It's recorded now.
Good. And thank you, Andy, for coming up with those details. I really appreciate it. So, Martha, I think that Cindy really answered your question about about that back edge and how to adjust it, and why we adjust it. But the thing to remember is you only need to make that adjustment where you extend the curve if you are putting it over your lobster tail bustle cage.
That's my plan.
Yeah, so then you want to make that adjustment. And you need to make that adjustment whether you are doing a train or not, or the poofs or not, regardless of what you are doing with that back panel, you always need to adjust that bottom edge by that amount.
Okay.
And so I'm
for
not
the basic,
doing...
yeah. So for the
ahead.
basic skirt, though, it sounds like I would just add the 5 or so inches onto the basic skirt, not like
Yes.
add the 5 inches onto a different one to cover the whole.
No, that's right. Just to the basic skirt. And when I do my overskirts, I don't need to make that adjustment. So because they usually are meant to be kind of loose and drapey in the back. And so they're like gathered up and folded and pleated, and all this wild stuff is happening to the back of the overskirts. So I just make sure that there's enough coverage on the foundation skirt that if I do what I'm doing now with the cheating out of my fabric, my overskirt is going to have an edge of beautiful fabric peeking through rather than muslin. And honestly, if I make a mistake with my estimation today, I can just always cover it with trim. You can always add more trim to things. So I've definitely had a skirt where I needed to like add more ruffles in back to like make up for a shortage. So yeah. Right. So let's look at a little bit what I mean when I say that I cut my big panel going widthwise rather than lengthwise in my fabric. So I'm going to open my fabric up, wait, lengthwise or widthwise, and I'm just going to confirm it is 45-inch wide. Excellent. So that I have enough length in the back. I'm so short that I can pull this off. If you're taller, you may not be able to do this with 45-inch wide fabric, and so you may need to piece in different ways. Here's the thing, though. If you're cheating out your fabric, like I am, you can put that piecing seam anywhere it will be covered. So if I needed to, I could piece a little rectangle at the top of my back panel to extend the length, for instance. Or I could bury those side seams in it to make it wider. Really, the only reason I need to do this is because I want a wider back panel. If you're satisfied with a 44-inch wide back panel, which is frankly very abundant, very decadent, and will look gorgeous. There's no critique of doing that width of panel. It's just that I want more. Then you do not have to cut your fabric this way. You can cut your back panel along the length of the fabric instead of the width. But this is a nice thing to know for any time you need to figure out a way to cut a panel that's wider than your normal width of fabric. It only works as long as the fabric doesn't have a directional pattern, or has some sort of coloration where if you go cross grain versus straight of the grain, the color is going to look different. Muslin is very forgiving. It looks the same every way you look at it. So I'm not worried about directionality of this fabric, but you have to think about that with anything with a pattern or color or color change to it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of seasickness potentially here for a moment, but I'm going to take you off the tripod so I can give you a full scope of what's happening, because I think that it'll be a little bit hard for me to otherwise show you what's going on here. So this is the width of my fabric. And so I've laid this out so that I'm going to cut the top of my back panel on the selvage edge and run the bottom towards the other selvage edge. And that is how I'm going to get my full width of the back panel onto this 45-inch wide fabric, because I need it to be, a little bit wider. So I'm going to trace it out the full 55 inches. Cake is going to help me, obviously, by being in the middle of the panel. But I know that even if I raise this up high, I'm not necessarily going to get you the best view. So I wanted to give you a little bit of that layout. And I do still do a double layer thing. I'm going to pull enough of the fabric back to fold it in half. So I've got the 2 layers cutting through and makes my life a little easier, as long as the cat allows me to do that. He's being very, very helpful today. I'm sorry, did I not give you your treats? Is that the problem? Is this what happened? I didn't give you your treats. Yeah. Clearly, I'm a monster. No wonder he's so married to the fabric. Okay. So I'm just creating my double layer of muslin here, making sure I fold it over so it's about 30 inches wide So I've got plenty to work with. And I marry up my selvages so I know that it's all even and straight of the grain and all of that. And I like to smooth it out. I'm having a little challenge because Kate keeps assisting me in the screen or in the area that's off screen. Hi, Cake. Hello. Hi. Hi, buddy. There you go. All right. Cool. And so once I've got that all lined up, smoothed out, ready to go, I am able to cut my back panel with the full width that I want. This poor thing, I have abused probably the most of all of the panels. I'm going to go right up to the selvage. That selvage will get lost in the waistband, so I'm not worried about having the selvage there. But you can see I've got plenty of width to expand so that I can get my full support for the back of my my bustle skirt. And normally what I do at this juncture is I simply trace in the bottom edge as I want to adjust it. And then I have one long cut on the side, which is not too bad. I can even simply tear off the width that I want and cut from side to side. So pretty nice. But I'm going to make this a little more visible for you all because the important part is honestly adding this additional little dip down at the bottom. And extending it to my new side seam. I'm just putting my pattern weights here so that I've got a control over this bottom edge. I'm going to pull out my curved ruler. You can absolutely use the hash mark method I showed you last time. But if you have got a curved ruler, it will make your life easier. I may end up extending my panel on the top a little bit so I can get the full extension here. So we are wanting to add about 6 inches in from the bottom edge. So I'm going to extend from that center point and add a little 6-inch hash mark there. And I'm going to try and extend my panel all the way to the side edge and like make my life a little more decadent. And give myself some tiny hash marks here as guidelines.
Are you going to have a poof in this underskirt?
I don't think I'm going to do a poof. That's a great question. I think I'm probably going to just add my signature petticoat netting to give it more body in the back. But if you want the poofs are there for decorative and functional purpose. It's just that when I went in to do my shortened panel, I still needed like about 2 inches more length here at the center point to go over my my lobster tail. So the other thing I'm going to do for myself is extend from this little point here at the corner to where I want the curved edge to finish on the side, so that I'm making my curve ease in to that side point.
We can't quite see how far over you're going.
Yeah, it's, hold on,
It's really wide.
really wide.
Yeah, they're perfect.
There we go. Yes.
So you're going off the edge that would be the bustle for,
Yes, as she drafted it, because I'm making it wider.
yeah.
And so I'm just gonna come in here and start my curve from that point. And extend my curved edge. Oops, it helps if the mark actually comes through. I'm just like making sure that my curve lines up in a attractive fashion. By the time I get over here, the curve is pretty flat. So I can like clean it up a little bit if I need to. This will all get X out the parts I don't like. So now I have my new curved edge for the bottom of my big back panel. And part of the reason why mine looks a little more dramatic is because I am making it wider for the drama. And then I can just go in here and I cut. It's a little hard to cut that far across for myself, so I'm going to go to the other side of the table. This is where it's nice to have 3 sides of the cutting table available. Being short is hard sometimes. Now I have this beautiful curved edge for the bottom of my bustle. Listen, you. Thank you. Okay. I just ripped off the side because the muslin will do that. So let's look at how I'm going to cheat in my fabric on this portion, because this is the one where I'm really saving the most fabric, and it's important to still consider how my overskirt is going to fall in the back here so that I don't have any of the muslin showing through. as a note, if you are choosing to do the poofs, there are these wonderful little pleats that are marked on the pattern. Make sure to take note of the poof marks. It calls them poofs, and also your pleats. We're going to talk about this more when we are constructing, but your pleats and back fold down like so, rather than folding up. And it's also important to make note of that. The downward pleat helps create some of the dimensionality of the poofiness in the back. And also in the front, you do front, upwards pointing pleats. So it can get a little confusing if you are doing the poofs and have a lot of pleats happening in your side seams because they go different directions. If you are doing the poofs, if you do want that additional element in the back of your skirts for the aesthetic or because you want to support really airy bustle shape, then let me know if you have any questions about creating those poofs or at least cutting them out. We will look at how you create them when we are finishing up our skirts. So for now, we're looking at how I'm going to cheat out this fabric. I don't need to worry about cheating out the side seam or the center back. I only need to put some silk here at the bottom edge because there will never be a point in which the side seam is exposed. The overskirt completely covers that. So I did 12 inches on the side panel. So I want at least 12 inches here in the back. I'm actually going to do a little bit more than that because I know that my bustle cage, or rather my overskirt, will have a lot of dimensionality to it. So I'm putting in a little 12-inch starter line as a guide. And I think I'm going to give myself another, I'm going to do another 9 inches on top of that. Because it's longest in this center back portion, I'm going to do like essentially a rectangular or a straight line all the way across. Because the side seam here gets lost more in the covering than the center back portion does. Get a longer ruler. I'm just going to trace a straight line all the way across the back here. So everything below the line is going to get covered in silk, and everything above the line will just be muslin and it will be hidden by the overskirt. So in this way, when I gather the overskirt or I move or what have you, all you'll see is the silk here, and it will give the illusion that there's a completely silk underskirt going on to support the look. Okay, so those are your cutting tips for the fabric today. Do you have any questions before we take a break, before we do book club this afternoon? Pockets? Yes. Yes. Man, we have not cut the pocket. We've not talked about pocket placement. We've just talked about the basic skirt placement. And maybe Wednesday I'll do just a whole thing on the pocket because I do add a pocket to my skirt and I want to enable you all to do your own pockets. There's one great place to put your pocket in. It's on one of the side seams between the side panel and the back panel. And so depending on your handedness is going to sort of decide which side you want your opening on and which side you want your pocket on. So I'm right-handed. I put my pocket on the right side and my skirt opening on the left side. But if you're a left-handed person, you may want your pocket on the left and your opening on the right so that your dominant hand can always find that pocket. If you are feeling very fancy, you can put a pocket and a placket in on the same side, but I usually just do the one pocket because it's very large. I can fit a lot into it. I can put a whole bottle of wine into that pocket if I choose to. So, not that I normally do that because it will throw off the drape of my skirt. It's too heavy, but I could. That's the point. So, we'll look at pockets, pocket making, pocket position on Wednesday and look at some other fine tuning like the placket and how we cut and prep that and how we cut and prep the waistband, because those are sort of like things we draft ourselves and not things that come in the pattern envelope. And they're wonderful fine tuning details that I think make the skirt a little bit nicer to wear. Oh, and I'm so delighted to be sharing this class with you. And also just getting to sew and chat with all of you is wonderful. Such a joy. I know that we all have sewing skills, that I am not necessarily the most expert about everything in this classroom, but I appreciate the exchange of ideas, the willingness to ask great questions, and your enthusiasm. It's really delightful to be around. So I will see you all on Wednesday for class, but this afternoon at 4:30. So that's 4:30 Pacific in Arizona, 5:30 Mountain, 6:30 Central, 7:30 Eastern tonight for our book club. All right. Good night. Good night. Goodbye. Oh my God. I'm going to go have some more caffeine and put an ice pack on my neck for this hot flash. I'll see you in a few hours.
Later.